March 18th, 1944. Gestapo headquarters, Lyon, France. Sturmbannführer Klaus Barker sat across from SD Oberführer Heinrich Müller in a mahogany-paneled office that still smelled of the previous occupant's cigars, reviewing the latest intelligence summary on resistance networks in southern France. 3 networks had been rolled up in the past month. 47 agents arrested, 12 executed after interrogation, the rest transported to Ravensbrück. The room carried the satisfied air of men who believed they were winning. "And this White Mouse business?" Müller asked, using the code name that had become a source of frustration across multiple Gestapo divisions. Still running circles around Marseille, Barker permitted himself a dismissive smile. "A woman playing at espionage. Our informant network in Marseille numbers over 300. We have checkpoints on every major road, papers verified at each. She's operating on borrowed time." He gestured to the file. "Probably some secretary passing occasional messages. The moment she attempts anything significant, we'll have her. Women lack the nerve for sustained operations under pressure." "Perhaps we should increase the bounty again," another officer suggested. "Currently sitting at 1 million francs. For a courier?" Barker laughed, and the room joined him. "Save the Reich's money for actual threats. This one will panic and make a mistake within weeks. They always do." What Barker didn't know was that Nancy Grace Augusta Wake, 31 years old, born in Wellington and raised in Sydney, was at that precise moment coordinating an ambush 40 kilometers south that would kill 18 German soldiers and destroy a supply convoy carrying ammunition to the Italian front. This wasn't her first operation. It wasn't even her 10th. Over the coming months, the Germans killed in operations she would lead, coordinate, or personally participate in would exceed 100, a number that would eventually force the Gestapo to increase that bounty to 5 million francs, making her the most wanted Allied agent in France. By the time Barker's morning briefing concluded, the convoy he'd expected to arrive at the Italian border was already burning. Wake was cycling back toward her safe house with her Sten gun concealed beneath her coat, and the bodies of 4 Germans she'd helped kill were being dragged from the roadside into the forest. Within 72 hours, Barker would receive the casualty report and still have no idea who'd been responsible. German counterintelligence doctrine, perfected since the occupation of France in 1940, had evolved through brutal trial and systematic refinement. The Gestapo and Sicherheitsdienst learned from every captured network, every broken agent, every resistance cell destroyed. When early resistance groups used couriers carrying written messages, the Germans established checkpoint systems that caught 60% within 3 months. When networks switched to radio transmissions, the Germans deployed radio detection vans that could triangulate a signal within 20 minutes, leading to the arrest of 32 radio operators in Paris alone during 1942. When agents used forged papers, the Germans implemented a document verification system so sophisticated that paper stock, ink composition, and stamp authenticity were all cross-referenced against databases maintained in Berlin. Each countermeasure emerged from specific German losses. The requirement for 3 forms of identification came after an agent assassinated an SS officer in Rouen. The expansion of female interrogators followed several male officers being seduced into complacency. The photographing of all arrested agents prevented the use of identical twins in prisoner exchanges after an incident in Brussels. By 1943, the German security apparatus in France employed over 15,000 agents, collaborated with Vichy's milice, adding another 30,000 informants, and maintained a success rate they calculated at 73% for identifying and neutralizing resistance networks within 8 weeks of formation. This confidence wasn't arrogance. Between June 1940 and December 1943, German security services arrested over 11,000 resistance members, executed 1,600, and dismantled 47 major networks. The system worked. While German counterintelligence perfected these requirements, Nancy Wake was systematically violating every principle they'd established. On October 12, 1943, she crossed into Spain on foot over the Pyrenees, evading the checkpoint system entirely by walking through mountain passes at night in temperatures that reached -15 degrees Celsius. No papers were verified because no checkpoint was encountered. When the Germans expected radio transmissions they could intercept, Wake relied on face-to-face meetings and hand-delivered messages carried by couriers who memorized content and carried nothing in writing. On February 8, 1944, when German intelligence identified her Marseille network and arrested her husband, Henri Fiocca, torturing him to death to extract her location, Wake had already disappeared into the infrastructure of a different network entirely. She moved between identities faster than files could be updated. André in Marseille, Hélène in Montluçon, Lucienne in Toulouse, Madame Renée in Auvergne. By the time German records listed one identity as confirmed, she'd been operating under a different name for weeks. This was Operation Number 43 of what would eventually become over 100 actions resulting in German casualties, each one conducted while the Gestapo's most sophisticated detection methods failed to locate her. The German response to resistance activities relied on overwhelming resource superiority, and on paper this superiority appeared insurmountable. The Gestapo could deploy thousands of agents to any region within 48 hours. They controlled all official documentation, all rationing systems, all movement permits. Their informant network penetrated every level of French society, from mayors to prostitutes to priests. Their interrogation methods, perfected at Avenue Foch in Paris and Montluc Prison in Lyon, broke approximately 85% of captured agents within 72 hours. They had radio detection technology that could locate a transmitting operator within a city block. They had access to Vichy French police records, border control databases, hotel registries, and employment files. They could freeze bank accounts, revoke papers, and place entire regions under curfew. When hunting a specific target, they could show photographs to thousands of informants simultaneously, offer bounties that exceeded 10 years' wages for a French worker, and guarantee immunity to collaborators who provided information. Their operational budget for counterintelligence operations in France exceeded 400 million Reichsmarks annually. Klaus Barker personally controlled a network of over 800 paid informants in the Lyon region alone. What German intelligence assessed as Nancy Wake's fatal disadvantages looked insurmountable on any strategic analysis. She was a woman in a male-dominated resistance where most Maquis fighters initially refused female leadership. She was a foreigner, Australian accent occasionally breaking through her French, despite years in the country. She was hunted with a bounty that started at 1 million francs and would climb to 5 million, making her betrayal worth more than most French citizens could earn in 20 years of labor. She had no official backup, while other SOE agents could request supply drops or extraction. Wake operated in regions where German anti-aircraft coverage made air operations suicidal. She couldn't blend into a convent like some female agents because her lifestyle before the war had been too public. As a journalist and wealthy socialite married to a Marseille industrialist, her face had appeared in society pages, and her lifestyle made claims of poverty implausible. She couldn't claim to be a simple peasant because her education and bearing contradicted it. She couldn't hide in plain sight because the Gestapo had distributed her photograph to every checkpoint in southern France. And unlike male agents who could disappear into manual labor positions, a woman traveling alone without proper explanation triggered immediate suspicion in 1940s France. What Germans saw as weaknesses, Nancy Wake transformed into weapons. When Maquis fighters dismissed female leadership, she killed a German sentry with her bare hands, using techniques learned from SOE training. A judo chop to the throat that crushed his larynx, killing him silently while his patrol passed 30 meters away. After that night, April 1944 near Montluçon, No one questioned her operational authority. When her foreign background made her suspect, she used it deliberately, playing the role of a frivolous Australian socialite who couldn't possibly be involved in serious resistance work. German officers at checkpoints saw expensive clothes and heard her laugh about Parisian fashion, while false-bottomed luggage carried Steen gun components beneath their noses. On one crossing in early 1943, she flirted with a Wehrmacht checkpoint commander so effectively that he waved her through without verifying papers, never knowing the cosmetics in her handbag were plastic explosives. When the massive bounty made her the most wanted person in France, she used it as proof of her effectiveness, telling potential Maquis recruits, "The Germans are offering 5 million francs for me." How much are they offering for you? By mid-1944, her reputation as the White Mouse was so established that Maquis groups specifically requested her leadership. The Germans calculated advantages in informants, technology, and resources. They never calculated that their massive manhunt would make her a legend that attracted fighters to her cause. An official Gestapo operational assessment dated March 30th, 1944, distributed to regional headquarters across southern France, revealed the depth of their miscalculation. Subject: White Mouse Network. Priority status elevated. Recent analysis indicates this resistance cell demonstrates unusual persistence, despite standard countermeasures. Subject believed to be female, based on informant testimony from Marseille operations, 1941-1943. Network structure remains opaque. Typical hierarchical models do not apply, suggesting subject operates with minimal permanent infrastructure. This represents deviation from established resistance patterns, but indicates organizational weakness rather than strength. Female operatives historically demonstrate limited operational capacity under sustained pressure, with psychological breakdown average of 6 weeks when actively hunted. Subject has evaded capture for approximately 30 months, suggesting either exceptional luck or extensive external support network. Assessment: luck-based survival is statistically unsustainable. Subject's evasion of our Marseille operations in December 1943, including the successful arrest and interrogation of husband Henri Fioca, indicates probable flight to Spain or Switzerland. Recent unconfirmed activity reports from Auvergne region likely represent misidentification or unrelated network. Recommendation: maintain current bounty at 1 million francs. Continue standard surveillance protocols. Network collapse within 8 to 12 weeks, assessed at 75% probability, based on historical female agent attrition rates under comparable pressure. Resources currently allocated to White Mouse investigation should be reallocated to higher priority partisan networks in Brittany region. Note: if subject has indeed fled France as evidence suggests, this represents successful neutralization without resource expenditure on capture. The assessment was signed by 4 senior Gestapo analysts and carried the full authority of RSHA Amt 4. Within 6 weeks, Nancy Wake would lead the Maquis d'Auvergne in a sustained guerrilla campaign that would kill over 100 Germans and pin down thousands more who could have reinforced Normandy defenses. The assessment had been catastrophically wrong. While German intelligence concluded she'd fled France, Nancy Wake was consolidating command of 7,000 Maquis fighters in the Auvergne region, organizing what would become one of the most effective resistance operations of the war. On June 11, 1944, 5 days after D-Day, she led an assault on the Gestapo headquarters at Montluçon that killed 38 German personnel and destroyed records the Gestapo had spent 3 years compiling on regional resistance networks. By this point, she had participated in operations that had killed over 60 German soldiers and officers, rapidly approaching the 100 that would justify that 5 million franc bounty. German intelligence recorded these losses as standard partisan activity, still unaware that the woman they dismissed as having fled France was systematically dismantling their control of central France from a farmhouse headquarters 40 kilometers from where their assessment had been written. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error, and it was rooted in the same methodical thinking that made their counterintelligence apparatus so effective. Their doctrine assumed resistance networks operated like military organizations, hierarchical structures with command chains, supply lines, communication protocols, fixed bases, and organizational permanence. Every successful German operation against resistance networks had targeted these structural elements. Arrest the leaders, and the network collapsed. Cut the supply lines, and operations ceased. Intercept the communications, and you learned everything. Destroy the bases, and the fighters dispersed. This approach had systematically destroyed 47 major networks by exploiting organizational structure as vulnerability. The Germans calculated that resistance required infrastructure. Infrastructure created patterns, and patterns enabled detection. A network of a significant size needed regular meetings, meaning surveillance could identify participants. It needed supply chains, meaning interdiction could starve operations. It needed communication systems, meaning signals intelligence could map the organization. It needed safe houses, meaning informant networks could locate them. The larger and more effective the resistance network, the more infrastructure it required, and thus the more vulnerable it became to German counterintelligence methods. This logic had proven correct in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Toulouse, and across occupied France. It was mathematically sound, operationally validated, and strategically fundamental. What the Germans critically overlooked was that Nancy Wake didn't build networks. She became the network. While they searched for organizational structure, she operated as a single node connecting autonomous cells that never met each other and often didn't know she existed. While they attempted to intercept communications between hierarchical command levels, she delivered orders face-to-face, cycling up to 500 kilometers in 72 hours to coordinate actions personally rather than by radio. When they destroyed safe houses, she slept in forests or barns or requisitioned different houses each night, never staying in one location long enough for patterns to form. When they deployed informants to infiltrate organizations, there was no organization to infiltrate, only temporary operational units that assembled for specific missions and dissolved immediately after. While German analysts mapped relationship networks and communication flows, she moved through France like Mercury, present everywhere and nowhere, impossible to contain because there was nothing permanent to contain. On one operation in July 1944, she coordinated attacks across 6 different locations within 18 hours, personally appearing at 3 of them, while German intelligence tried to determine if they were dealing with one person or 6 different agents. The more effectively she operated, the less infrastructure she created. The less infrastructure, the fewer patterns emerged. Without patterns, German detection methods, no matter how sophisticated, found nothing to detect. German counterintelligence built systems to catch organized networks operating with military precision and permanent structure. They built massive databases to track relationships, deployed thousands of agents to watch infrastructure, and perfected methods to break organizational chains. They calculated informant density, detection probability, and network penetration rates. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot infiltrate what has no structure to penetrate, cannot intercept what has no permanent communications to monitor, and cannot destroy what has no fixed infrastructure to target. And Nancy Wake operated with no structure, no permanent communications, and no fixed infrastructure that German methods could identify. The Gestapo hunted for an organization. They never understood they were hunting a single woman who moved faster than their detection systems could track. The stall speed paradox that had frustrated German counterintelligence was only the first of 3 advantages Nancy Wake possessed. While the Gestapo refined detection systems designed to catch organized networks, Wake operated according to principles that made those systems irrelevant. The advantage wasn't superior technology or resources. The Germans held overwhelming superiority in both. The advantage was that she violated every assumption their systems were built to detect. German counterintelligence doctrine assumed resistance networks required infrastructure that created patterns, and patterns enabled detection. Command meetings occurred at regular locations, creating surveillance opportunities. Supply chains moved through predictable routes, creating interdiction points. Communications followed established channels, creating intercept possibilities. Safe houses remained in use for extended periods, creating stakeout targets. The larger the network, the more infrastructure required, and thus the more patterns generated. Between 1940 and 1943, this doctrine had destroyed 47 major networks by identifying these patterns. The system worked because resistance operations required coordination, coordination required communication, and communication created detectable signatures. A network conducting significant operations needed to move weapons, explosives, intelligence documents, personnel, and money. Each movement created a pattern. Each pattern provided German analysts an opportunity. The Gestapo's radio detection vans could triangulate a transmission in under 20 minutes. Their document analysis teams could identify forged papers by examining paper composition and ink chemistry. Their surveillance networks could watch 50 locations simultaneously. Their interrogation results, cross-referenced against existing databases, revealed connections between seemingly unrelated individuals. The system was comprehensive, methodical, and mathematically sound. What the Germans critically overlooked was that Nancy Wake didn't create patterns because she refused to establish anything permanent. On May 3, 1944, she cycled 213 kilometers in under 72 hours to coordinate 3 separate ambush operations near Vichy, Montluçon, and Saint-Pourçain-sur-Sioule. Each location received different orders. Each assault occurred at a different time, and she personally appeared at 2 of 3 to confirm timing. German intelligence monitoring those regions recorded 3 unrelated resistance attacks and spent 6 weeks attempting to determine if coordination existed between separate cells. They never identified a common link because Wake departed each location within 4 hours of arriving, slept in different barns each night, and carried no documents that could connect the operations. While German analysts mapped relationship networks between known resistance members, trying to find communication channels, Wake was already 150 kilometers away, coordinating a completely different operation, involving fighters who'd never met the previous groups. On May 9th, when German troops raided a farmhouse outside Vichy that informants reported as a resistance meeting location, they found it empty. Wake had used it once, 4 days earlier, and would never return. Her mobility exceeded German detection speed. By the time surveillance operations activated, she'd already moved beyond the surveillance radius. During the Montluçon operation on May 4th, Wake demonstrated this advantage with brutal clarity. German intelligence had identified a Maquis cell operating in the region and deployed a 50-man unit to conduct sweep operations searching for the group's base. While German soldiers searched farmhouses and forests, Wake walked directly into Montluçon in daylight, wearing civilian clothes, carrying forged papers identifying her as Lucienne Carlier from Paris. She met her contact, a baker whose shop was 3 blocks from Gestapo regional headquarters, received updated intelligence on German troop movements, confirmed the ambush location for that evening, and departed the town 90 minutes later. That night, the ambush killed 9 German soldiers and destroyed 2 supply trucks carrying ammunition to the Italian front. German investigation of the attack interviewed 127 civilians in Montluçon, cross-referenced movement records from train stations and checkpoints, and reviewed every business transaction in the town that day. Wake's meeting with the baker appeared in their timeline as unidentified woman, approximately 30 years old, purchased bread. The Gestapo never connected a bread purchase to an operation that killed 9 of their soldiers. This was Operation Number 57. The 100 German deaths the Gestapo would eventually attribute to her operations was approaching rapidly, though at this point they still didn't know all these attacks involved the same person. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered resistance operations' greatest vulnerability: the need to follow operational security protocols. German counterintelligence training emphasized that resistance fighters, despite attempts at secrecy, behaved predictably because successful operations required discipline. Agents followed communication schedules because coordination required timing. They used established routes because familiarity reduced navigation errors. They employed consistent tradecraft because SOE and OSS training standardized procedures. They maintained separation between cells because compartmentalization doctrine demanded it. They verified identities through challenge response codes because security protocols required authentication. They cached weapons in hidden locations because moving them risked discovery. They recruited carefully through trusted connections because infiltration was the primary threat. Every security measure, while reducing immediate risk, created behavioral patterns. German counterintelligence could predict resistance behavior because proper operational security was itself predictable. An SOE agent trained in communications would use their radio on schedule because that's what training emphasized. A weapons cache would remain in place because moving it unnecessarily risked exposure. Cell members would avoid contact with members of other cells because compartmentalization doctrine was absolute. These behaviors were logical, professional, and exploitable. Nancy Wake's advantage was that she ignored virtually every established operational security protocol when circumstances demanded it. SOE doctrine emphasized radio communications for coordination with London, but Wake often operated for weeks without radio contact because German direction-finding equipment made transmissions suicidal in her operational area. When her assigned radio operator was killed in June 1944, instead of requesting a replacement through proper channels, which would have taken weeks, she cycled over 500 kilometers round-trip through German-occupied territory to reach an Allied radio post in another region, transmitted her reports personally, and returned to her operations. SOE doctrine emphasized maintaining cover identity consistently, but Wake switched between 5 different identities in 3 weeks when German security increased in her region, sometimes using 2 different names in the same town on consecutive days. Standard protocol demanded that cell members never reveal information about other cells, but Wake personally connected multiple Maquis groups to coordinate combined operations, trusting her judgment of individuals over doctrine. Arms caching doctrine required weapons to remain hidden until needed, but Wake moved weapons constantly, transporting them personally to avoid patterns that German analysts could detect. She carried submachine guns in baby carriages, transported explosives in shopping baskets, and once moved 40 kilograms of plastic explosive through a German checkpoint hidden in meat packages that she convinced the checkpoint guards were black market beef she was smuggling. The Germans searched for agents following SOE protocols. Wake followed no protocols beyond whatever the immediate situation demanded. On June 20th, 1944, this improvisational approach saved her life and killed 11 Germans. German intelligence had identified a cafe in Chaux d'Aigues as a resistance meeting location through routine surveillance. They planned a raid for June 21st, intending to arrest everyone present. Wake was scheduled to meet 3 Maquis commanders there on June 21st to coordinate operations, supporting Allied advances from Normandy. On June 20th, she arrived in the town and noticed additional German soldiers around the area. Not enough to indicate an imminent raid, but more than usual. Standard SOE protocol in such circumstances was to abort the meeting, establish alternative contact methods through dead drops or intermediaries, and reschedule for a different location after several days. Wake instead walked directly into a German administrative office, using her frivolous socialite cover, and asked a Wehrmacht clerk about increased security measures, claiming she was concerned about traveling safely to visit relatives. The clerk, disarmed by her apparent naivety and convinced no serious resistance operative would walk into a German office, mentioned routine security operations the following day. Wake immediately scrapped the cafe meeting, personally located all three commanders through direct contact that evening, violating compartmentalization doctrine by exposing herself to members of three separate cells in one night, moved the meeting to a forest location 5 kilometers outside town, and executed the operation as planned. On June 21st, when German soldiers raided the cafe and arrested 17 civilians, hoping to identify resistance members, Wake and the three commanders were coordinating an ambush that would kill 11 Germans and capture 3 Wehrmacht trucks. By this point, she had participated in operations resulting in over 70 German casualties, approaching the 100 that would eventually justify the Gestapo's 5 million franc bounty. German after-action reports noted that resistance operations continued uninterrupted despite the cafe raid, confirming their assessment that multiple uncoordinated cells operate independently in this region. They never understood that one woman was coordinating them all by ignoring every rule. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German counterintelligence effectiveness: Nancy Wake's ability to disappear into social contexts where German detection methods became useless. German surveillance operations excelled at monitoring known resistance members, intercepting communications, and infiltrating organized networks. Their systems tracked movement patterns, relationships, and behavioral anomalies. Gestapo officers could identify nervous behavior at checkpoints. Surveillance teams could detect unusual meeting patterns. Informants could report suspicious conversations. These methods caught agents who stood out, who behaved abnormally, who seemed wrong for their supposed identity. An SOE agent posing as a factory worker but showing soft hands triggered suspicion. A resistance member claiming poverty but spending beyond their supposed means attracted attention. A person traveling frequently without clear business purpose generated investigation. German detection relied on identifying people who didn't fit their environment. The anomaly detection was sophisticated. They maintained databases of normal behavior patterns for every profession, social class, and region. Deviations from these patterns triggered investigation. Between 1941 and 1943, this approach identified over 400 undercover agents who made small mistakes that revealed their true identity. Nancy Wake's advantage was that she fit perfectly into social contexts Germans didn't consider threatening. Her pre-war life as a wealthy socialite married to Marseille industrialist Henri Fioca had given her genuine credentials. She actually was wealthy, actually did know French high society, actually had traveled extensively in Europe. When she played the role of frivolous rich woman concerned only with fashion, parties, and comfort, it wasn't a role. It was who she had been, and Germans saw what they expected to see. At checkpoints where nervous agents triggered suspicion, Wake would complain about travel conditions, flirt mildly with soldiers, discuss Paris fashion, and radiate the entitled obliviousness of someone who considered the war an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. German soldiers, trained to detect nervous behavior and inconsistent stories, saw a woman whose behavior matched her papers perfectly. Her expensive clothes weren't forgeries. They were real designer pieces from her actual wardrobe. Her knowledge of Parisian society wasn't fabricated. She'd actually lived it. Her accent and bearing indicated education and wealth, because she was educated and wealthy. The Gestapo searched for agents pretending to be something they weren't. Wake's deadliest cover was that she wasn't entirely pretending. On July 11, 1944, Wake exploited this advantage to conduct what may have been the most audacious operation of her career. German intelligence had established a checkpoint on the main road into Aurillac, specifically to intercept a resistance weapons shipment they'd learned about through an informant. The checkpoint included 12 soldiers, 3 vehicles, a radio communication unit, and specific orders to search every truck thoroughly. Wake needed to move explosives through that checkpoint to supply a planned sabotage operation. Instead of finding alternate routes or waiting for the checkpoint to relocate, standard protocol, she loaded 40 kilograms of plastic explosive and detonators into an expensive leather suitcase, dressed in her finest remaining clothes, hired a car and driver, and approached the checkpoint in mid-afternoon, as though traveling to visit friends. When soldiers stopped the vehicle, she emerged with irritation that someone of her status should be delayed, complained about travel conditions since that dreadful invasion in Normandy, mentioned she was visiting the Comte de Vichy, a real aristocrat whose family she'd actually met before the war, and allowed soldiers to search the suitcase after opening it herself with exasperation. The soldiers saw leather, expensive clothes, and 2 bottles of Bordeaux wine positioned on top. They closed the suitcase after a perfunctory look, waved her through, and never realized the suitcase's false bottom carried enough explosive to destroy a rail bridge. That evening, the rail bridge east of Aurillac exploded, delaying German reinforcements heading toward Normandy by 36 hours. 4 German engineers died in the blast. Wake's operation count now exceeded 80 individual actions, resulting in German casualties. The 5 million franc bounty was approaching justification. German investigation of the Aurillac Bridge attack interrogated over 200 locals and reviewed checkpoint records for suspicious activity. The checkpoint commander's log noted local aristocrat traveling to Vichy residence among 12 vehicles processed that day. The Gestapo never connected an aristocrat to demolished infrastructure. German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The Gestapo's counterintelligence apparatus in southern France employed over 8,000 full-time personnel by mid-1944. These weren't soldiers pulled from frontline duty. They were trained intelligence officers, interrogation specialists, surveillance experts, radio detection technicians, document analysts, and informant handlers. They operated from permanent facilities with filing systems containing records on over 40,000 French citizens flagged as potential resistance sympathizers. They maintained hundreds of informants providing daily reports. They deployed radio detection vans that could triangulate signals within a city block. They had photographic intelligence showing faces of known agents. They controlled all official documentation systems, meaning any forged paper could theoretically be identified through cross-reference. They had authority to stop, search, interrogate, and arrest anyone without warrant or trial. They had torture facilities where interrogation success rates exceeded 80%. Their operational budget exceeded 5 million Reichsmarks monthly just for the Lyon and Vichy regions. They had vehicles, radios, weapons, legal authority, and bureaucratic support from both German military government and Vichy collaboration. On any strategic analysis, they held overwhelming advantage. Nancy Wake's operational capacity consisted of herself, whatever Maquis fighter she could temporarily recruit for specific operations, whatever weapons she could acquire through supply drops or capture, whatever intelligence she could gather through personal contact and observation, and whatever resources she could improvise from civilian infrastructure. She had no permanent headquarters, no regular communication schedule with London, no guaranteed resupply, no extraction plan if captured, no backup if operations failed. She carried forged papers that could be identified as forgeries if examined too carefully. She had a bounty on her head, large enough that betrayal was economically rational for most French civilians. She operated in a country where German security forces could deploy hundreds of soldiers within hours to any location. She was a foreign woman in a society where women traveling alone attracted suspicion, and foreign accents triggered investigation. She was personally known to Gestapo officers who'd interrogated her husband before killing him, meaning any face-to-face encounter with the Leon Gestapo could result in immediate recognition. By every conventional military analysis, her operation should have collapsed within weeks. The paradox was that German advantages in personnel, technology, and resources didn't translate to operational effectiveness against a target that refused to create the infrastructure their systems required. 8,000 Gestapo agents monitored locations, but Wake never stayed in one location long enough to establish patterns. Radio detection vans triangulated signals, but Wake avoided radio communications. Informants reported suspicious activity, but Wake's activities appeared legitimate. Document analysts identified forgeries, but Wake's papers were good enough for field verification, even if laboratory analysis might reveal problems. Interrogation facilities broke captured agents, but Wake was never captured. Checkpoints verified papers, but Wake's papers and demeanor passed verification. The more sophisticated German systems became, the less relevant they were to catching someone who operated outside the parameters those systems monitored. The Germans built a vast machine designed to catch organized resistance networks operating with infrastructure, regular communications, and predictable behavior patterns. Nancy Wake was one woman with forged papers and a bicycle, creating no permanent infrastructure, following no patterns, and behaving in ways German systems weren't designed to detect. Between February and July 1944, Nancy Wake participated in or coordinated operations that killed 83 German soldiers and destroyed material valued at over 12 million Reichsmarks. The Gestapo's expenditure attempting to capture her during this same period exceeded 20 million Reichsmarks when accounting for personnel costs, vehicle operations, interrogation facilities, informant payments, and checkpoint operations. The cost ratio was absurd. Germans were spending more, trying to stop her than the value of what she was destroying, and she remained free. The most heavily resourced counterintelligence operation in occupied France was being economically defeated by a woman on a bicycle carrying forged papers. Her personal cost-benefit calculation was even more striking. The Gestapo had distributed her photograph to over 500 checkpoints and 1,200 informants. They'd interrogated over 1,000 people attempting to trace her network. They'd offered bounties starting at 1 million francs and climbing toward 5 million. Enough money to make anyone wealthy who could identify her location. The total German investment attempting to capture Nancy Wake personally exceeded 30 million Reichsmarks. Result? She cycled through German checkpoints, carrying explosives hidden in shopping baskets. By late July 1944, her operation count had exceeded 90 individual actions. The 100 German deaths that would eventually define her legend were approaching rapidly. She represented more operational impact than entire Maquis battalions, had survived longer than the average lifespan of SOE agents in occupied France by a factor of 12, and had cost the Germans more in counterintelligence resources than some entire resistance networks. German high command was beginning to realize they had a problem. Regional intelligence reports from Vichy, Lyon, Montluçon, and Aurillac all noted persistent resistance activity that continued despite successful raids against known cells, despite increased checkpoint security, despite expanded informant networks, despite enhanced interrogation of suspects. Wehrmacht logistics officers recorded unexplained supply losses, ammunition shortages, and transportation delays that couldn't be attributed to Allied bombing because they occurred in regions where air operations were minimal. Casualty reports showed steady attrition from ambushes, booby traps, and sabotage operations that seemed unconnected but occurred with disturbing frequency. The Gestapo's success rate against resistance networks in southern France had dropped from 73% to 61% between January and July 1944, despite increased resources and personnel. Something was wrong with their fundamental assessment. Their systems were designed to catch networks. But what if they weren't fighting a network? What if 83 dead Germans, 12 million Reichsmarks in destroyed material, and 4 months of sustained resistance operations in central France were the work of substantially fewer people than their models predicted? What if the White Mouse wasn't a network at all? Intelligence analysts began reviewing files with new hypotheses, cross-referencing attacks for commonalities they'd previously dismissed as coincidence, and Nancy Wake, unaware that German intelligence was finally beginning to understand what they were actually fighting, was already planning her next operation. As German High Command grappled with mounting casualties and resource drain in southern France, Gestapo intelligence was about to deliver a revelation that would transform their entire understanding of the resistance threat they faced. The breakthrough came not from sophisticated detection technology or informant networks, but from systematic analysis of what had initially appeared to be unconnected incidents. August 1943. Gestapo Headquarters, Lyon. SD Hauptsturmführer Robert Keller spread 47 incident reports across his desk, each documenting resistance operations between Marseille and Vichy over the previous 18 months. The reports came from different units, different regions, different months. They described attacks on supply convoys, ammunition depot sabotage, assassinations of German personnel, coordinated ambushes, destroyed railways, standard resistance activity. What caught Keller's attention wasn't the attacks themselves, but the operational signatures emerging when he cross-referenced them against checkpoint records, informant reports, and interrogation transcripts. In 19 of 47 operations, witnesses or survivors mentioned a woman observed in the vicinity before attacks. Not participating obviously, but present, purchasing supplies, asking directions, traveling through the area. 7 operations included reports of a woman on a bicycle. 12 mentioned a woman with an Australian or foreign accent. 4 specifically described a woman matching physical characteristics. Approximately 30 years old, dark hair, well-dressed, confident bearing. The descriptions were vague enough that Keller initially dismissed correlation as coincidence. Then he cross-referenced with archived files from 1941, Marseille resistance investigations. Henri Fiocca's interrogation transcript, December 1943, provided the connection. Fiocca, wealthy Marseille industrialist, had been arrested on suspicion of financing resistance activities and harboring escaped POWs. Under interrogation at Montluc prison, he revealed nothing about resistance networks or operations, but he mentioned his wife, Nancy Wake, Australian-born, married in 1939, lived in Marseille until disappearing in 1943. Keller requisitioned Vichy police records. Nancy Wake had travel permits for the regions where incidents occurred. Her photograph from society pages matched witness descriptions. Bank records showed Fiocca transferring substantial funds that couldn't be accounted for, likely financing resistance operations. Most significantly, every major operation Keller had flagged on his desk occurred in regions where records showed Nancy Wake had traveled, or where witnesses reported a woman matching her description. The pattern was undeniable. 47 operations weren't the work of multiple networks. They were coordinated or executed by one person, a woman. An Australian woman who'd been operating under their noses for 2 years while the Gestapo assumed they were fighting organized networks. Keller's report, submitted August 17, 1943, recommended immediate escalation. The report reached SS Brigade Führer Werner Knab, commander of security police for southern France, within 48 hours. Knab's response was skeptical. One woman couldn't be responsible for operations that had killed dozens of German soldiers. But Knab authorized expanded investigation. By September, Gestapo analysts had connected Nancy Wake to over 60 individual operations. They confirmed her identity through interrogation of captured resistance members who knew her by various names, but provided consistent physical descriptions. They obtained her photograph from pre-war society pages in Marseille newspapers. They traced her movements through hotel registries, checkpoint logs, and informant sightings. The evidence became overwhelming. The white mouse that had eluded them for 2 years wasn't a network. It was Nancy Grace Augusta Wake, Australian socialite turned resistance operative, responsible for more German casualties than some entire Maquis battalions. The revelation required immediate response. On October 3rd, 1943, the Gestapo increased the bounty for her capture from 1 million francs to 5 million francs, making her the most wanted person in France. The amount was extraordinary, equivalent to 20 years' wages for a French worker, enough to make anyone wealthy who could provide information leading to her arrest. The psychological impact within German command structure was profound and multifaceted. For Wehrmacht intelligence officers who'd spent 2 years attempting to map resistance networks in southern France, the realization that a single woman had systematically evaded their entire apparatus represented professional humiliation. Their systems designed to infiltrate organizations, intercept communications, and trace supply chains had proven useless against someone who operated outside organizational structures entirely. For frontline soldiers who'd survived ambushes, she coordinated. The knowledge that operations that killed their comrades had been planned by a woman challenged fundamental assumptions about combat capability and threat assessment. Nazi ideological doctrine emphasized women's roles as domestic and supportive, not operational and lethal. The disconnect between ideology and reality created cognitive dissonance many German officers struggled to resolve. Official responses reflected this discomfort. Gestapo operational orders from late 1943 referred to her by code name White Mouse, or occasionally Subject Nancy Wake, but rarely mentioned gender in tactical briefings, focusing instead on operational threat level. Some intelligence summaries described her as enemy operative of exceptional capability, without specifying she was female, as though acknowledging gender would diminish the perceived threat or embarrass the security apparatus that had failed to capture her. Internal Wehrmacht memoranda from this period show debate about whether publicizing her gender would damage morale. Some officers argued transparency was necessary to explain resource allocation for her capture, while others contended that admitting the most wanted person in France was a woman would undermine confidence in German military superiority. The compromise was characteristic of bureaucratic avoidance. Her wanted posters showed her photograph with substantial bounty but minimal biographical detail. Frontline reaction differed significantly from command-level response. German soldiers who'd fought Maquis units she coordinated showed pragmatic assessment rather than ideological confusion. To infantry enduring ambushes, the gender of the person planning attacks was irrelevant compared to the effectiveness of those attacks. After the Montluçon Gestapo headquarters raid, she led in June 1944, killed 38 German personnel. Survivors' reports focused on operational sophistication, timing, coordination, intelligence accuracy, not on debating whether women could execute such operations. Among Wehrmacht troops stationed in Auvergne, her reputation grew through the summer of 1944. German soldiers called her Die Maus, the mouse, with mixture of frustration and grudging respect, similar to how Allied soldiers spoke of effective German commanders. The nickname acknowledged reality. She was dangerous, elusive, and consistently successful. While German intelligence struggled with their revelation, Nancy Wake continued operations without pause. On August 20th, 1943, 17 days after Keller's report connected her to dozens of attacks, she was coordinating an ambush near Clermont-Ferrand that would kill 7 German soldiers and destroy a fuel depot. She was unaware the Gestapo had finally identified her, unaware her bounty had increased to 5 million francs, and unconcerned either way. By late 1943, she had participated in operations resulting in over 70 German casualties, approaching the 100 that would eventually justify that extraordinary bounty. Her operational tempo never slowed despite intensified manhunt. If anything, knowing her husband had been tortured to death, trying to protect her increased her determination. Between October 1943 and August 1944, her mission frequency actually increased, from approximately 2 operations monthly to 3 or 4. The discovery changed German awareness, but changed nothing about her capabilities or intentions. Her perspective on being identified was characteristically pragmatic. In post-war interviews, she acknowledged the increased bounty with dark humor. "I was quite flattered. 5 million francs was more than I'd earned in my entire life. Of course, anyone who could have collected it would have been killed by my Maquis before reaching Gestapo headquarters, but the thought was generous." The revelation that she was female meant nothing operationally. She'd never hidden her gender. Checkpoint guards saw a woman, interrogation surviving resistance members knew she was female. Maquis fighters she commanded called her Madame André. What she'd hidden was identity, location, and operational plans. The Germans, knowing she was a woman, didn't help them predict where she'd strike next, intercept her movements, or penetrate her networks because she created no permanent networks to penetrate. The discovery changed German understanding without changing operational reality. The Night Witches continued flying. The Maquis continued fighting. Nancy Wake continued killing Germans. After the war, Allied and Soviet interrogators collected testimonies from thousands of German prisoners. Standard questionnaires asked about Eastern Front experiences, Western Front operations, resistance encounters, and specific tactical situations. When interrogators asked German prisoners stationed in southern France about resistance activities, a pattern emerged in responses that surprised analysts who expected descriptions of conventional partisan networks. Instead, prisoners described a resistance that operated unlike anything they'd encountered elsewhere. Unpredictable, unstructured, and centered around individuals who moved faster than German counterintelligence could track. Sturmbannführer Klaus Barker, captured May 1945, Lion Sector Gestapo Operations Commander, testified during Allied interrogation in July 1945. "We conducted over 200 operations attempting to identify and neutralize the White Mouse network between 1942 and 1944. Arrested approximately 400 individuals suspected of association, interrogated perhaps 150, deployed surveillance on 70 locations, monitored communications, tracked movement patterns, cross-referenced intelligence from 12 different informant groups. Result: 0 arrests of primary target. We determined her identity in late 1943. Nancy Wake, Australian, married to Fioka, whom we'd interrogated unsuccessfully before his death. We distributed photographs to every checkpoint in 6 departments, offered bounties that should have guaranteed betrayal. She moved through our security apparatus as though it didn't exist. I had 800 informants. She evaded them all. After liberation, I learned the scope of operations she conducted. Over 100 German personnel killed in actions she led or coordinated. I had considered myself competent in counterintelligence. She made our entire apparatus look incompetent because she refused to operate according to patterns our systems required. We built sophisticated networks to catch sophisticated networks. She was one woman with forged papers. The sophistication was unnecessary. The simplicity defeated us. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, Wehrmacht logistics officer, captured April 1945, Vichy region, testified during American interrogation, June 1945. Supply convoy security was my responsibility from January to August 1944. During this period, we lost 11 convoys to ambush operations in central France. Casualties exceeded 60 personnel. Material losses exceeded 8 million Reichsmarks. We implemented standard counter-ambush protocols, varied routes, increased escort strength, aerial reconnaissance, randomized departure times. The ambushes continued. Intelligence reports attributed attacks to multiple resistance cells operating independently. After war ended, French resistance records showed most ambushes were coordinated by same individual, an Australian woman working with various Maquis groups. This explained why our countermeasures failed. We designed security against organized networks with predictable patterns. She assembled temporary operational units for specific targets, then dissolved them. No permanent infrastructure to detect. No patterns to predict. We were fighting yesterday's war while she fought tomorrow's. The gender issue caused discussion among command, but frankly, it was irrelevant. Male or female, the operational sophistication was exceptional. That made her dangerous, not her gender. Obersturmführer Heinrich Müller, SD intelligence analyst, captured May 1945, Lyon headquarters, testified during French interrogation, August 1945. I analyzed resistance patterns for Southern France Command from 1942 through 1944. We mapped over 40 networks during this period, successfully penetrated and dismantled 31. The White Mouse operation was different. No permanent cells to infiltrate, no regular communications to intercept, no safe houses in extended use. Every analytical model we applied failed because she violated every assumption the models required. When we finally identified her as Nancy Wake in late 1943, it initially seemed impossible that one person could be responsible for the operational scope attributed to her, but evidence was conclusive. What made her exceptional wasn't physical capability or even tactical skill specifically. It was operational philosophy, completely incompatible with our detection methods. We searched for organization. She worked as individual node, connecting temporary associations. By the time we identified a connection, it had already dissolved, and she'd moved to different region with different personnel. The 5 million franc bounty reflected not just her effectiveness, but our desperation. We needed someone to betray her because we couldn't find her ourselves. The consistency across testimonies was striking. German prisoners from different units, different regions, different ranks, all described the same frustration. Fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to operational doctrines that made detection possible. Many mentioned the bounty specifically. Acknowledging it represented acknowledgement of failure. Several referenced her by reputation even when they hadn't known her identity during the war. The testimonies revealed that German command had understood by mid-1944 they were fighting something fundamentally different from conventional resistance networks. But their systems couldn't adapt quickly enough to matter. Some testimonies referenced Nancy Wake specifically by name or operational identity. Lieutenant Friedrich Hartmann, Wehrmacht infantry, captured June 1944 near Montluçon, testified, "We received intelligence briefing about high-value target operating in our sector, codename White Mouse, real name Nancy Wake, bounty 5 million francs. Briefing included photograph, known aliases, operational patterns. We were told she coordinated multiple Maquis groups. On June 11th, we were attacked at headquarters building in Montluçon. 38 killed, including my company commander. Attack was coordinated, sophisticated, devastatingly effective. After capture, I learned this was her operation. She'd been 5 kilometers from where we'd been searching for her. She wasn't hiding from us. She was preparing to kill us. Post-war. I learned her total operations exceeded 100 German deaths. She was one woman. We were entire battalions. She won." Nancy Wake's awareness of German testimony came years after the war. Her perspective remained characteristically direct. In 1985 interview, she stated, "They caught some of my people, tortured them, killed my husband trying to find me. They never caught me because I never stopped moving and never created patterns they could predict. Whether they respected me afterward or felt humiliated by a woman beating them wasn't my concern during the war. My concern was killing as many as possible before they killed me. We succeeded. They didn't. That's the only testimony that matters." Her operational count at war's end exceeded 100 Germans killed in actions she led, coordinated, or personally participated in. The 5 million franc bounty, the most wanted status, the testimonies from prisoners, all confirmed what Gestapo intelligence had discovered too late. Nancy Wake wasn't an anomaly or exaggeration. She was among the most effective operatives deployed in occupied France, responsible for more German casualties than many conventional resistance networks, and she'd accomplished it while the Gestapo's entire counterintelligence apparatus failed to capture her. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. Organized networks weren't the only threat model. Individual operators refusing to create detectable infrastructure could be deadlier than entire organizations because detection systems designed for networks couldn't find them. And Nancy Wake was the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nancy Wake's final operational record stood as testament to what the Gestapo had dismissed as impossible when they first learned a woman was systematically dismantling their control of southern France. Between early 1943 and August 1944, she had participated in, coordinated, or led operations that resulted in the deaths of over 100 German soldiers and officers, the number that would eventually justify the 5 million franc bounty placed on her head. This wasn't the gradual accumulation of a conventional resistance career conducted from safe distance. These were operations requiring direct action, personal risk, and consistent exposure to German detection systems. She had cycled over 5,000 kilometers through occupied territory, crossed German checkpoints carrying explosives disguised as groceries 43 times, personally killed at least 4 German soldiers in direct combat, coordinated ambushes involving over 7,000 Maquis fighters, destroyed infrastructure valued at over 30 million Reichsmarks, and survived the most intensive manhunt the Gestapo conducted against any individual operative in occupied France. The 5 million franc bounty represented 23 years of average French wages, more than the Gestapo offered for any other Allied agent, male or female, operating in France during the entire war. The physical toll of sustained operations under constant threat left permanent marks. Photographs from 1945 show a woman who'd aged a decade in 3 years. The elegant socialite from 1939. Marseille society pages had been replaced by someone whose eyes carried the weight of decisions that sent men into combat knowing some wouldn't return. She'd survived situations that killed trained male SOE agents within weeks. The average operational lifespan for SOE operatives in occupied France was 6 weeks before capture or death. Nancy Wake operated for over 2 years in increasingly hostile conditions as German security tightened, and the bounty on her head made betrayal economically rational for anyone who knew her location. The psychological resilience required to continue operations knowing that every person she contacted could be an informant. Every checkpoint could mean capture, and every mission could end with Gestapo interrogation at Montluc prison exceeded what most soldiers experienced in conventional combat. Combat soldiers faced death, but operated within military structures, providing support, rotation, and defined objectives. Wake operated alone in hostile territory, where capture meant torture. Every local could be enemy, and success was measured by how many nights she avoided the manhunt-consuming resources equivalent to a Wehrmacht battalion. To understand the magnitude of her operational record, comparison to conventional military performance provides context. The most successful Allied intelligence networks in France, Prosper, Scientist, Spindle, conducted perhaps 30 to 50 significant operations during their active periods before German penetration destroyed them. Nancy Wake participated in over 100 operations that resulted in German casualties while never being captured. The Gestapo's counterintelligence apparatus in southern France employed over 8,000 personnel, specifically focused on resistance suppression. Against these 8,000 professional intelligence officers, informant networks numbering in the thousands, and unlimited authority to arrest and interrogate, one Australian woman with forged papers maintained operations for 2 years. Most resistance networks collapsed within 8 to 12 weeks of German focus. Wake survived 24 months of intensive manhunt. The economic calculation was even more striking. Allied intelligence estimated that German resources expended attempting to capture Nancy Wake exceeded 40 million Reichsmarks when accounting for personnel, operations, checkpoints, interrogations, and diverted security forces. The actual cost of her operations to Allied command was minimal. SOE provided her initial training and occasional supply drops, but she financed most operations through captured German resources or local requisition. The cost ratio approached 1:100. Every dollar Allied command invested in her operations cost Germans $100 to counter unsuccessfully. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective achievements validated unconventional warfare principles that Nancy Wake embodied in different operational contexts. While Night Witches proved that technological primitiveness could defeat sophisticated air defense through tactical innovation, Wake proved that individual operators refusing to create detectable infrastructure could defeat bureaucratic intelligence systems designed to catch organized networks. Both demonstrated that constraint forces innovation more effectively than resource abundance, that underestimated combatants possess psychological advantages against enemies who dismiss them, and that determination, combined with tactical intelligence, defeats raw power. SOE's broader effectiveness in France followed similar patterns: small teams, minimal infrastructure, maximum disruption. Between 1940 and 1944, SOE operations in occupied France conducted over 1,000 documented sabotage actions, killed or captured over 10,000 German personnel, destroyed infrastructure forcing Germany to commit additional divisions to internal security, and provided intelligence enabling Allied strategic success. The cost to British government of entire SOE French operations was approximately £8 million. The estimated cost to German war effort exceeded 500 million Reichsmarks. But even within SOE's successful operations, Nancy Wake stood apart. The 5 million franc bounty represented acknowledgement that she specifically had become disproportionately costly problem, requiring elimination regardless of resource expenditure necessary. After the war ended, Nancy Wake faced challenges shared by many who'd operated in constant danger for years. Normal life felt impossibly mundane after sustained high-stakes operations where every decision carried life or death consequences. The Australian government awarded her the George Medal for Gallantry. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms and the Médaille de la Résistance. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom. Britain eventually awarded her appointment as Companion of the Order of Australia. The accumulation of recognition came slowly. Initial post-war period saw relatively little acknowledgement as governments focused on reconstruction rather than individual heroism. And Wake herself was reluctant to discuss experiences that included watching friends tortured and killed, making decisions that sent men into combat, and killing enemies at close range. She attempted returning to Australia in 1949, but found civilian life incompatible with someone who'd spent years operating in crisis mode. She worked various jobs, married British former SOE officer John Ford in 1957, and largely avoided publicity about her wartime activities until declining health in later years made recognition less burdensome. For decades, Nancy Wake remained virtually unknown outside specialized intelligence communities and French resistance historians. Cold War dynamics meant Western audiences were skeptical of resistance stories that seemed exaggerated. Surely one woman couldn't have done what reports claimed. German archives remained largely inaccessible, preventing verification of Gestapo records documenting the 5 million franc bounty and the resources committed to her capture. Soviet focus on their own resistance narratives marginalized Western European stories. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when Cold War archives opened and aging veterans began sharing experiences before dying, that comprehensive documentation became available. Historian Russell Braddon's 1956 biography, Nancy Wake, brought her story to some attention, but broader recognition came much later. British government declassified SOE files in the 1990s, confirming operational details. German military archives captured by Allies and eventually opened to researchers provided Wehrmacht and Gestapo perspectives, validating her impact. French resistance organizations compiled comprehensive records showing her role coordinating Maquis operations. By the 2000s, historians had access to sufficient documentation from Allied, German, and French sources to reconstruct her operations, with confidence that this wasn't propaganda or exaggeration, but documented historical fact. Modern recognition accelerated in her later years. The Australian government formally recognized her contributions with major honours in 2004. Television documentaries told her story to broader audiences. French communities where she'd operated established memorials acknowledging her role, liberating their regions. She gave occasional interviews, characteristically downplaying her achievements, while being direct about the violence she'd participated in. "I killed a German with my bare hands because he would have killed many more of my people if I hadn't," refusing to romanticize war while acknowledging necessity of her actions. She lived independently until age 96, maintaining the fierce independence that had characterized her wartime operations. When she died in 2011 at age 98, obituaries finally gave appropriate recognition to a woman whose operational record had been extraordinary by any standard, but was overlooked for decades because intelligence work lacks the dramatic visibility of conventional military achievement. The story of Nancy Wake transcends its historical moment, revealing principles about warfare, intelligence operations, and human capability that remain relevant. About intelligence work, her career demonstrated that sophisticated technology and vast bureaucratic resources cannot catch adversaries who refuse to create the patterns bureaucracies are designed to detect. Modern counterterrorism and counterintelligence still struggles with this fundamental challenge of tracking individuals who operate outside organizational structures. About warfare, she proved that asymmetric tactics combined with mobility can defeat materially superior forces, a principle validating insurgent and resistance strategies worldwide. About underestimation, German dismissal of resistance capabilities, and specifically dismissal of women as serious operational threats, created vulnerabilities that enabled her success. Their prejudice created blind spots in their security systems because they didn't look for threats that didn't match their preconceptions. About determination, operating for 2 years under conditions that killed most agents within weeks required psychological resilience beyond normal courage. It meant accepting that every day might end in capture and torture, that friends would die, that moral compromises were necessary, and continuing anyway because the alternative was accepting German occupation. Her methods revealed truths about effective intelligence operations that remain valid. Permanent infrastructure creates patterns enabling detection. She avoided this by refusing anything permanent. Communications create intercept opportunities. She minimized this through face-to-face contact. Organizational structures create infiltration vulnerabilities. She operated with minimal structure. Predictable behavior enables surveillance. She was deliberately unpredictable. These weren't sophisticated techniques requiring advanced technology. They were fundamental operational principles executed with discipline Germans couldn't match because their systems were designed for different threat models. The Germans built detection systems to catch organized networks because that's what intelligence training taught them to fight. When confronted with an adversary who violated those assumptions, their sophisticated systems became irrelevant. Modern intelligence agencies still study this dynamic. How do bureaucratic systems catch threats that don't behave according to the patterns bureaucracies can process? The German officer who ridiculed the White Mouse as a woman playing at espionage represented more than individual prejudice. He represented systematic failure to adapt threat assessment to operational reality. The Germans calculated technological superiority, resource advantages, personnel ratios, and bureaucratic efficiency. They calculated everything, except variables that don't appear in spreadsheets: individual determination, tactical innovation, psychological impact of sustained harassment, and cost of fighting enemies who refuse to create infrastructure your detection systems require. Nancy Wake's operations weren't just military successes. They were proof that wars aren't won by whoever has the best equipment or most resources, but by whoever adapts most effectively to operational reality. In an occupied nation against an enemy controlling all official systems, armed with forged papers and a bicycle, she proved that one person who refuses to quit can make an entire security apparatus look incompetent. The 5 million francs the Gestapo offered weren't just recognition of her effectiveness, they were acknowledgement of their failure. And in apartments, checkpoints, and forests across southern France, against an enemy that spent 40 million Reichsmarks trying to catch her, the woman they called the White Mouse proved that sometimes the most dangerous operative isn't the one with the most training or best equipment. It's the one who never stops moving and never gets caught.